Good evening. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. And this is the host tonight, Craig Trulia. And with me tonight is Subdeacon Daniel Kakish. He is Syriac Orthodox. And also with us tonight is Peter G., who is just a layman within the Patriarchate of Antioch. But he's got opinions because he's a layman from there. But he's in no official capacity. So, Peter, Subdeacon Daniel, how are you doing this evening?
Good.
Doing well, Greg. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having us, Craig.
So it's great to have both you guys, and God willing, we'll have Deacon Joseph Sweden on in a few minutes. He will also be giving perspective, but before he gives some backgrounds on the issue, I want to maybe do something introductory because it buys us some time for Deacon Joseph Sweden, which is this. The thesis, lack of a better term, is that every Arab I've spoken to that's Orthodox are under the perception that their churches are in communion and an open communion within the bishops. It's more of a kind of open secret that with the Melkites, if you're near death or whatever, they'll still commune you. But I'm not aware of any official thing with bishops. So that being said, it wasn't something that I find it controversial, but it's like kind of out of my control. I'm a peon. So what do I care? What can I do about it, right? And so it's something I've been aware that exists, not from firsthand knowledge. I've been to Antiochian churches, and so I went to liturgy or vespers there or something like that, but never went to a Syriac Orthodox church. But that being said, this is an issue I could speak historically, which would be very similar to what had happened between the Council of Chalcedon and the Council of Constantinople II. For most of that time, there's decades of an agreement called the Henoticon. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. That's everything I pronounce. And with that document was essentially saying, kind of, you believe what you want about Chalcedon, let's just not talk about it so it doesn't make a big old fight. And that was essentially the status quo for decades in the East. Now, I don't know, because I'm not Syriac Orthodox, maybe Subdeacon Daniel Kakish could tell us how this agreement is perceived by you guys. But among the Eastern Orthodox, it's not perceived positively. It was necessary to essentially condemn this agreement and everyone who was part of it in order for the Eastern Orthodox to re-enter communion, really, which was still part of the Orthodox Church then, the Patriarchate of Rome. That was their condition. You cannot have this document. You cannot have this agreement. And so if you were to take the traditional Eastern Orthodox view, this would mean if we have, and Deacon Joseph Sweden will be giving the argument tonight that maybe there isn't such an agreement or it's misunderstood or misconstrued, but if such an agreement does exist, and that's what I want you guys to talk about tonight, it means in some respects, if we go by tradition, we've taken a step back. But maybe what's going on right now is maybe more nuanced than this. And so this is where I stand as in just what I'm aware of, right? I don't have super strong opinion. I know on paper that it's wrong, but I'm not a bishop. It's really not my problem. So that being said, I think what I'll do is I'll give Subdeacon Daniel, because you are a clergyman, maybe some time to respond, to maybe give us some context as to how maybe the Henoticon is perceived within the Syriac Orthodox communion. And maybe you could give us then some background as to what, as you understand it, is the agreement between the bishops of the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Antioch Patriarchy.
Okay, sure. So the Henoticon, as you know, it was the agreement by Emperor Zeno from 484 until 518, putting into communion the Eastern Chalcedonians with the non-Chalcedonians, beginning with Acacius, Patriarch of Constantinople, throughout the period until Justin becomes emperor after Anastasius. So what this agreement essentially said was, like you put it, Christ is one and not two. It doesn't say not one what and two what. It just says Christ is one and not two. And that we would agree to accept the 12 anathemas of St. Cyril, condemn the 3 chapters. A lot of Constantinople 553 maybe finds its source in the Henoticon era as a reconcile, like an attempt to reconcile the non-Chalcedonians. And it says that whoever, and then also it anathematizes Nestorius and Eutyches, and it says whoever does not agree with this, whether now or any time or at any council, even if it was at Chalcedon, let him be anathema. That's what the Henoticon said. So this was signed by the Eastern Chalcedonians and by us. There are people who are currently canonized in the Eastern Orthodox Church who had accepted the Henoticon agreement. As you guys know, Flavian II of Antioch and others. So Severus, when he became patriarch in 512, both sides recognize him until 518. We continue recognizing him. The Chalcedonians stopped because they signed the Libellus of Hormistus, so the Henoticon is no longer valid. But in 518, or actually when Severus became patriarch, he began to push more for an explicit condemnation of Chalcedon. So if really for the Syriac Orthodox, the Henoticon was seen more as like kind of a compromise on our part for the Chalcedonians, that they can somehow not condemn Chalcedon to keep it, but to understand like Orthodox Christology, even if they are Chalcedonian, because it doesn't explicitly condemn Chalcedon as heretical, the Henoticon. It's interesting in that Oriental Orthodox is very like diverse liturgically. Chalcedon attempted to enforce like an imperial. It tried to make us conform with imperial Christology of the Tome of Leo, and he was saying natura, and it was translated to physis, and then it kind of was trying to force that on the Syriacs and the Copts and people who don't talk that way. So by the Henoticon essentially is the same. It's diversity and communion together, different ways of speaking about the same thing. And then now with our agreement in the Syriac and Antiochian churches, if you want to view it as similar to the Henoticon, I think that could be fair, because we are saying that in the agreement it says that we do agree on Christology.
So let me rewind a little bit, because
Sure.
Deacon Joseph Swayden is here, and I'll just say aloud, we'll not mute our microphones for the sake of StreamYard. But so you just gave at least the background that we were talking about. And so fast forward to the 90s, if you could, now that Deacon Joseph's with us, and Deacon Joseph, could you say something in your microphone, make sure everything's okay?
Okay.
Perfect. So that being said, so Deacon Daniel, if you could tell us what transpired in the 90s, what, as you understand it, are the elements of this agreement, and then after you give that, perhaps you could give your opinion on it, and then we'll give Deacon Joseph Swayden time to present a contrary viewpoint.
Sure. So Peter and I, we've been discussing this, and we kind of looked into the history of the agreements, because it was kind of like a series of agreements. It wasn't just the agreement of Antioch. It wasn't an isolated event. So I'm going to quickly summarize it, because I've been talking for a long time already, and then Peter can expand later. So they begin in 1989, 1990, where it's the entire families of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Oriental Orthodox Church. Bishops from most of the churches are present, and it's expanding each time. Each time there is more and more bishops are coming. Peter will go into detail later about that. And then they are agreeing on Christology. They're agreeing on how to apply any form of communion or intercommunion or whatever, giving it up to the local patriarchates to decide when and how, lifting the anathemas and so on and so forth. So within this context, 1989, 1990, 1991, November, the agreement between Antioch, Eastern Orthodox, and Oriental Orthodox happens within that context. And then 1993, there's another a collective agreement between, again, both families. And the names of the bishops and priests who are present and representing their patriarchates are present and signed for each of these agreements in the early 90s.
So you're saying the actual patriarchs of each jurisdiction?
Patriarchs or their representatives.
They're delegates, okay.
Yeah, and the only objection that I found was a few monks of Mount Athos, not even a patriarchate or anything, but a few monks of Mount Athos writing to the ecumenical patriarch, I think it is, complaining that the Antiochians went into communion with the non-Chalcedonians, and when the non-Chalcedonians haven't accepted Chalcedon and the following councils yet. It's not necessarily saying that we disagree on Christology in the complaint. It's simply saying we haven't accepted the councils. And this is their objection to it. But no patriarchate, from what I've seen, has offered any objection, and Antioch has not nullified it on either side.
And then just to clarify, as far as you're aware, in these serious agreements, it reached the zenith where full-blown communion is permissible between both jurisdictions.
Antioch and Antioch, essentially, if you have like,
what do you mean by? I'm going to press a little bit. What do you mean by essentially?
This is what it is. Like, I'm going to tell you what the agreement says, and then you tell me if it means full communion. If, let's say, Peter's bishop is presiding or is present in my parish, and my bishop isn't there, Peter's bishop becomes the president of our liturgy, and he's the main celebrant of our liturgy, and vice versa. If my bishop is at Peter's parish, it's the same thing. My bishop then takes over the liturgy at Peter's parish, and they are communing, the lay people and whoever else is present, the priests that are helping or the deacons. The celebrant is communing everybody. So, and there have been times where clergy has been exchanged, and there's concelebrations of liturgy. So this is not me saying what's happening. Of course this is happening, but this is me telling you what the agreement is actually saying.
Now, what have you seen? And then we're going to give Deacon Joseph Sweden a considerable period of time in order to respond to this. What have you seen firsthand? I remember us talking about some of your backstory, and you would see the priest of both parishes celebrating all the time on a regular basis. You mentioned that you called the Metropolitan of the Patriarchate of Antioch himself. He picked up the phone and he said, "Can I go to the Syriac Orthodox Church?" He said, "Yeah." So you heard it right from the Metropolitan. Is this, am I repeating accurately, or am I forgetting something?
No, that's correct. That's right. Also, the Antiochian priest who chrismated me, he recently reposed in the Lord. He actually would come to our parish, the Syriac parish, and concelebrate multiple times and commune with us.
Okay, so that's good background information here. Now, Deacon Joseph, I'm very grateful you came on this evening. You're actually the inspiration of the show, because I just made a passing comment on this, and you mentioned, no, that's not strictly accurate. And I said, well, then I want to give you the opportunity to correct the record as best you know how. So, Deacon Joseph, thank you for coming on this evening.
Excuse me. Thank you for having me.
And so, Deacon Joseph, let me give you an opportunity to respond, particularly if you would like, to the context of the Henoticon, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong again, and then maybe get into the details here, Pravi, of the actual agreement between, again, neither jurisdiction you're in communion with, which would be
Correct.
the patriarch, patriarch of Antioch and the Syriac patriarch.
Excuse
And
me.
so, give us some of that insight.
I've been sorry.
God willing, you're
was,
okay.
I was just eating, and I got these jalapeno vegan sausages, and they're really hot. And just started. I was trying to get it down, and it kept coming back up. Okay. Anyway,
Wait, thinking, Joseph, aren't you like part Brazilian or something?
no, part Peruvian. But I'm also
they're not spicy, I don't think.
no. They like spicy food. It's just
Oh,
that it was this weird vegan thing that started to just coagulate in the throat, and then I was trying to get it out, and it just wouldn't go. But another part of me is Lebanese, and this is part of the reason. This is part of the reason why I take this issue somewhat seriously. I see that we have an Antiochian under the patriarchate here. We have Subdeacon Daniel, who's under the I assume you're with the Jacobites, and this relates to me personally because of the fact that I have cousins in both of your churches. So this is not something in which I'm not invested. It's not like I'm like going to just sit here making fun of, Antioch. I have a lot of respect for the institution. The reason I was actually it was a family member who was concerned by that meeting that made me speak out or say something that got us to where we are today. So I don't. But this, I'm going to be honest with you. It's starting from ground zero for me because, as you know, I'm a traditional Orthodox that's separated from the patriarchates. I didn't know as much as I needed to know in order to approach this. So I did a couple of things. One thing which wasn't exactly productive for me, but I thought it was the right thing to do. But more importantly, I began to research what actually occurred over the past 50 years. And in doing this, I came to the conclusion that there's a lot more going on than what meets the eye. It's a much more complicated situation, and I will go back to the Henoticon because ultimately, like a lot of these agreed statements, when you get all the way up to the ones where it governs concelebration, so on and so forth, all of those they sound very similar to the Henoticon. It's kind of we say this, you say this, and we're just going to keep it at that. Now, where I hesitate is because of the fact that in the U.S. and I don't know, I'm not sure, Subdeacon Daniel, where were you born here in the U.S.?
Yes.
Okay, so the stuff you're talking about occurred in the U.S. That's why I asked, because what I remember, and this is again, Peter can correct my memory here. I can't find any documentation on it. But I remember when those agreements first came out, it was said that they weren't going to govern the Antiochian Archdiocese in the U.S. I have not found that documentation. I've tried. I've even written people in the Antiochian Archdiocese, but I had no response. So the point is that from that perspective, reading the history and the documents gives me pause, and it left me feeling uniquely unqualified to have this discussion because of the fact that it is a very complicated situation. And I'm not just saying it's complicated on the Chalcedonian end, because it's complicated on the non-Chalcedonian end. Because on the one hand, on the Chalcedonian end, there's everything from the.
So that I almost had a naked baby running in the background.
Oh, okay.
That's very, very weird to see that happen. I'm sorry.
He escaped. Okay.
Continue. I'm sorry. Stealing your thunder.
No problem. The point is that on the Chalcedonian side, there's a lot. You see a lot all the way up until 1993. A great deal of tolerance for the concept of just leaving the questions of the councils alone. On the non-Chalcedonian side, and this is what I thought was very interesting, we see the revival of Coptic monasticism, most notably with the Father Matthew the Poor. And now the reason that this is important, and I thought this was so odd, was that Father Matthew the Poor was a great advocate, and some argue that this is because of stuff he had received from Father Lazarus Moore when he was becoming a novice monk, on divinization. Now, divinization is a concept that is generally considered foreign outside of Chalcedonian Orthodoxy because of the fact that the question of the two divine natures being so unique, for us naturally makes sense. And I'm speaking and saying as Chalcedonians, but as non-Chalcedonians, it's not as common. That language was sometimes considered Nestorian, and as a matter of fact, Pope Shenouda ended up fighting with Father Matthew the Poor for years, and I believe he condemned him at one point. But that leads me to question if our language is becoming more of the same. And this is something that I researched of Father Charles Boz. I guess when he was a seminarian, he's kind of a very ecumenical guy, and he's not a big fan of traditionalists, but he actually did for his college dissertation, he actually interviewed Patriarch Ignatius. And in interviewing Patriarch Ignatius, what they said is that the approach that they were taking with the non-Chalcedonians was to verify at every step whether they were believing the same thing. So, in other words, verification at baptism. Do you believe Christ is perfect God? Do you believe Christ is perfect man? And people were answering yes. But the thing is, for example, with the Coptic Patriarchate of Alexandria, they're flatly saying no, that's not the same thing. And so the point is, what it made me realize is that there's a great deal of confusion and division. And if we just take the Antiochian Patriarchate by itself, you have two very large groups of people who have been estranged for hundreds of years and are both under Islamic domination. So that's a very difficult situation to be in to begin with. That was one of the things that this Father Charles Boz covered in his discussion with Patriarch Ignatius. He said, would you recommend somebody who only has a non-Chalcedonian church to go there? And he said, well, if the choice is Islam, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I? So the thing is, it's a much more complicated situation that I, as an outsider, because I'm still technically an outsider, felt very uncomfortable. And I think you noticed, Craig, I started expressing some reservations because I was getting a distinct sense that this is a very complicated situation. And I certainly was not going to try to come in here and speak for the Patriarch of Antioch because I'm not a member. That would be wrong of me, and I assume that's why Peter's here. But the point is, I'm just simply saying it's much more complex on both sides. If in the long term, the non-Chalcedonians are using more and more Chalcedonian languages, then it's only a step to go before they can just accept the councils. And so I think that's my assessment. And it's a weird one, I understand, but that's all I'm going to say on that one.
Well, I think you gave us a lot of good background info there. But let me ask this follow-up to you, Deacon Joseph, which would be, so would you say, until you read more, are you agnostic whether or not these agreements particularly allow intercommunion between both the Syriac Orthodox and the Patriarch of Antioch?
Well, I mean, my opinion, and again, my opinion is not as a representative of the Patriarchate of Antioch. I can't make that distinction. But I was under the impression that people had to be received from Oriental Orthodoxy, and I was under that impression from the letter I cannot find from Metropolitan Philip. That said, that may not be the case now. If that's not the case, then I would assume that the intercommunion, that they're kind of, for lack of a better words, the 91 and 93 agreements are sort of rubrics to be used, like who stands where when there's two people of different churches who are doing a wedding or doing a local consecration of a cathedral, things like that. Things that, as I personally, I could not on my end, and I think that that's something that even Father Charles Boz brings up, that it was unacceptable to the Greeks as well, to the New Calendar Greeks, is that I couldn't see that. I could not see doing concelebrations with people who don't recognize the 7 ecumenical councils. But I'm not in Antioch. And I don't understand that situation, and it is much more complicated. Is it necessary here? Absolutely not. I'll just tell you, learn the 7 councils, and that's it. But when you're the choices you have over there, especially with Islam dominating the discussion, it's a much more nuanced and complicated situation. And I'm not going to sit here and say, well, I would. The answer is no, I wouldn't do it. But the answer is also I'm not there, so I'm loath to be as judgmental. But I don't see that here. I mean, here at the church, here we had somebody who was a Copt. They became Antiochian Orthodox, and they're in the seminary now. And that's the experience I've had, is that people do still convert. But I can't. The situation there is a much different one. Just this week, Vladimir Putin was talking about building a copy of the Hagia Sophia in Damascus because of the fact that Erdogan turned Hagia Sophia back into a mosque. So but that would be a great thing for the Syrian Patriarch to have. But anyway, so
it sounds to me that you're somewhat skeptical, that you think that maybe these agreements are more detailing how they would receive converts to, let's say, Chalcedonian Orthodoxy.
No.
All right, so please clarify then.
No, what I'm saying is that's what I've seen in practice. However, no, those agreements do talk about between the Antiochian and the Syrian churches. They have an agreement like that with Alexandria too, in terms of placement of priests and stuff like that. So that's something that does happen over there, and that's something that Metropolitan Philip, to my recollection, rejected and said that doesn't apply to the American archdioceses. But that's not. But Metropolitan Philip is dead, so I have no idea. God rest his soul. But I have no idea what the policy of Metropolitan Joseph is. If you're telling me Metropolitan Joseph allows it, then that's all I can say. I have nothing to say to that.
Well, Metropolitan Joseph allows a lot of things, but let's speak to Peter G. So Peter, you heard what Deacon Joseph had to say, and so if you could give us more background, are these agreements being blown out of proportion, and they're just about where people stand during certain certain things, like when the community is getting together and they happen to be different jurisdictions, or is this more profound and this really is the rubric to how they intercommune?
So first and foremost, I'm going to say that I at least partially agree with what Deacon Swayden says, and insofar as this is a confusing topic. There's a lot of confusion around it. I will also preface everything I'm about to say by saying that I'm not representing, the Antiochian by any means, but this is information that I've gathered over the years, and I am presenting it here. Me and Daniel, Subdeacon Daniel here, have actually, gone over this extensively. But just to start, I think, I think a lot of what Deacon Swayden says is valid. There is a lot of confusion. If we simply narrow down this agreement to what occurred in 1991, we don't necessarily get a full picture. In fact, we don't even get a real picture at all. It just seemingly feels like the two synods met in Antioch in Syria and just arbitrarily decided to restore some sort of limited communion. I also want to say, before I even go on, I don't know how this applies to America. Every bishop, I guess, reserves the right to enforce it their own way. I haven't been able to find any documents nullifying the synodal decree from 91. So there are a lot of questions, right? But just to backtrack a little bit, I think what's important here is the timeline. I think that's one thing a lot of people miss when they start evaluating this agreement. Subdeacon Daniel hinted at it earlier. This didn't just originate in 91. It didn't even originate in 89. This started in 1964 with a set of, I guess we could call them unofficial meetings, like joint dialogues. To be exact, there were 4 unofficial dialogues followed by 4 official dialogues in the 70s and 80s, and culminating with like the official dialogue in Egypt in 89. If you read these dialogues, what you find starting in the 60s, 64, and I believe that one, if I'm not mistaken, was in Germany. Maybe I'm wrong there, or Denmark. I'd have to double check. But in any case, what you find in these 8 meetings is a lot of a lot of grace, and I guess in so many ways, kind of like flip-flopping, making realizations that they didn't realize prior to. You have bishops and representatives of various patriarchates on both sides, Oriental and Eastern Orthodox, who, you know, in many ways are discussing the differences and realizing, hey, maybe, you know, maybe we were wrong here, or maybe these nuances didn't exist, or what have you. And then you find the culmination. So what happens in 1989 is very pertinent to the Antiochian Syriac agreement. What happens in 89 in Egypt, the representatives from both synods meet in Pope Shenouda's residence, I believe, right, Daniel?
The
Yeah,
89.
yeah. So they meet at Pope Shenouda's residence, who at the time the Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria, and they form a Christological agreement, an official Christological agreement. It's pretty heavy Christologically, and I'd encourage people to read it. They create a committee to go out and essentially, they first create a set of recommendations, then they create a committee to go out and evaluate some of the differences. Well, what happens is, if I'm not mistaken, in 1989, they commenced the dialogue with 5 to 7 representatives. In 1990, about 6 months later, when they come back to discuss their findings, they came back with 33 representatives throughout between both the synods. We're talking Ethiopian, we're talking Antiochian, Greek, Russian, Bulgarian. I mean, everyone was there. And by the way, the older joint dialogues, it's had some pretty big hitters there. I mean, they had Romanides, Meyendorff, it had Zazoulis, it had a bunch of well-known Orthodox figures who were participating in those dialogues. So just for the sake of brevity, in 89, 90, you have in 89 a Christological agreement, and then in 90 you have proposals for lifting anathemas. Again, these are official joint agreements. In fact, I can read some pretty I'll wait on this, but in both dialogues, a point of interest that you see in the recommendations is the synods agree to relegate how this formula for, I guess, reunion, for lack of a better word, it's not really reunion as much as it's a restoration of some sort of limited communion between the two synods. But the recommendations do call for the heads of the local churches individually to settle the matters. And that's kind of where the Antiochian Syriac agreement comes in 91. I think the final joint dialogue, if I remember correctly, was in September of 91, and then the Antiochian Syriac synodal agreement comes out in November of 1991. And in that agreement, you have essentially what seems to be, at least on its face, some sort of limited communion agreement. It's pretty specific as to, you know, what is permitted between the two communities, and not so much what isn't, but I guess by virtue of what is, we know what probably isn't.
How about you give us a little bit of those details?
Yeah, in fact, they're very short. I'll probably just read them to you guys. Let's see. So point 2, for example, point 2 says that it is important to plan an exchange by visits by our heads of churches and prelates, priests and lay people of each one of our two families of churches to the other. Point 4 says, and these are not in reference to concelebration. The document makes that very clear. In localities where churches of the two families coexist, in which case would be Syria, the congregations should organize participation of one group of people, men, women, youth, and children, including priests where possible, from one congregation of one family to a congregation of the other, to attend in the latter's Eucharistic worship on Sundays and feast days. Point 6 says churches of both families should agree that they will not rebaptize members of each other for recognition of the baptism of the churches of our two families if they have not already done so. So pretty weighty verbiage, right?
Well, let me see if I'm understanding. I don't pretend to have a very high IQ. In fact, it's the opposite. But so here's what it sounds like. What I just heard. It sounds like they don't want parallel jurisdictions. So whatever bishop's in town, which whatever patriarchate, essentially switches jurisdiction. Right? When he walks in, now you're Syriac Orthodox. He walks out, the other one walks in, now you're Eastern Orthodox. So that sounds to me.
It sounds that way.
Okay, so that's what it sounds like.
I should clarify, because I do want to clarify this, that I personally, and again, this is my belief, is that the 7 councils are non-negotiable. Just in case anyone thinks that I'm saying that they're not.
We're gonna give an opportunity for everyone to pick on each other in a little bit. But let me just try to needle at you a little bit, Peter, so to see if I'm understanding this. So it does sound like this agreement, like it's almost like when you're trying to, in a war and there's an armistice, so you make borders. They kind of say, all right, well, there'll be no parallel jurisdictions. We're not going to impede laity from attending feast days at one or the other. So I presume there'd be a calendar difference.
Well, Craig, if I may.
Sure.
What I read to you was the precursor to the Antiochian Syriac agreement. That's what led into the agreement. In just a few moments, I'll read a few more excerpts from the actual agreement.
Go right ahead. Again, low IQ, so keep fleshing out for us, Peter.
So point 3 on the actual Antiochian Syriac agreement states that both churches shall refrain from accepting any faithful from one church into membership of the other, irrespective of all motivations or reasons. Point 4 of the same agreement, meetings between the two churches at the level of their synods according to the will of the two churches will be held whenever the need arises. Point 6, if bishops of the two churches participate at a holy baptism or funeral service, the one belonging to the church of the baptized or deceased will preside. In case of a holy matrimony service, the bishop of the bridegroom's church will preside. Number 7 simply states that the aforementioned points are not applicable to concelebration of the divine liturgy, but then it goes into what seems to be concelebration. Point 9 says in localities where there is only one priest from either church, he will celebrate services for the faithful of both churches, including the divine liturgy, pastoral duties, and holy matrimony. He will keep an independent record for each church and transmit that of the sister church to its authorities. Point 11 says if a bishop from one church and a priest from the sister church happen to concelebrate a service, the first will preside even when it is the priest's parish. And finally, number 13 says godfathers, godmothers in baptism, and witnesses in holy matrimony can be chosen from members of the quote-unquote sister church.
Now repeat the one you said just before that one, because that sounded to me like explicit concelebration.
Sure. It says if a bishop from one church and a priest from the sister church happen to concelebrate a service, the first will preside even when it's the priest's parish.
Yeah, this is the agreement that, by the way, that I was mentioning that Metropolitan Philip said wasn't applicable here. So this is why I'm so confused with what happened with Subdeacon Daniel. But more,
and I'm not, and Deacon, I'm not taking the position that it's applicable here in America. I'm simply presenting that the document, and I guess even more so, the agreement does indeed exist. To what degree, I don't know. How it's enforced, I don't know. Has it been nullified? I don't know. I haven't been able to find any sort of documents showing such. So, with that said, I think if we're just taking the agreement and the timeline of events leading up to the agreement, if we just take it at face value, this is basically where we arrive, whether we like it or not.
Well, the thing is this, and this is where I'm gonna get a little cynical, because I'm a cynical person by nature. I think outside of faith in Christ, I have faith in very little else.
Is it the air in Pennsylvania that does it to you?
No, I've always been like this. Anyway, so there's for reference, I found a very interesting text. It was prepared by the Copts, which actually includes a lot of these early meetings. And so the 1960s meetings. What's interesting is that the meetings in 1961 and 1964 don't actually have any representatives of the Chalcedonian Antiochian Patriarchates. They only have representatives of the Greeks and the Russians. So it's not until the third meeting that the Antiochian Chalcedonian side is even brought in. More importantly, and this is again, and I can't stress this enough, that once again, I don't want to sound too cynical, and I don't want to sound too I don't want to sound cruel, and I don't want to offend obviously Subdeacon Daniel or Peter. I don't want to offend anyone really, but if we're being honest, in 1993, representatives of the non-Chalcedonian churches wanted to enact what they had agreed upon. And what they had effectively agreed upon, if you read into these documents, is that ultimately Chalcedon's anathemas are irrelevant. And so that's actually in some of these documents. The point I'm trying to make is that ultimately, then the rest of world Orthodoxy never went along with it. So they even last year, I think it was, or the year before, representatives of the non-Chalcedonians went to the Patriarch of Moscow asking to restart the discussion from 1993 because that would lead to its ultimate conclusion, which would be the shucking of Chalcedon. And the point is, they said, the Patriarch looked very nervous and quietly said, we'll push this off for another time or go back to Constantinople and ask them. And that's been the status quo for the past 24 years. So while in practice, there are developments in terms of people in Antioch, for example, celebrating, but as I mentioned, there's also tendencies towards where people in the non-Chalcedonians are adopting a more Chalcedonian stance. That the anathemas, as far as I know, have never been abrogated and still haven't been, even though that was the ultimate goal of those discussions, was to do that. Because, I mean, obviously we would see the consequences if we did that. If we said, say, for example, the Church of Greece or the Church of Russia said that it was no longer necessary to maintain Chalcedon, then for all effects and purposes, that's the end of the argument. That would mean the non-Chalcedonians are right, and we should all just give up the remaining four councils, or relegate them to a lower standpoint in history. And so this is where we come into where we have there's a global realpolitik at play here that we're not discussing, and maybe we should. I don't want to, and I don't. Again, like for example, when I'm thinking of like what the leadership does, and this is again. I don't want to be the guy that rehashes out all the historical issues. I'm sure Subdeacon Daniel's familiar with them. I'm sure Peter's familiar with them. Before the ecumenical movement, clergy, people on both sides sold out the other guy at times. And that was brought up in some of the discussions, and it was kind of just agreed to like, let's not play the game of who's worse. But ultimately, what the 93 agreements were about were to effectively abrogate Chalcedon, and that has not been done. I personally will never support it, and I think if it was done, I think just as I am a rogue Chalcedonian, I am outside of the mainstream of Orthodoxy among the traditionalist Orthodox. If that happened, if they were to do, let's say they said, okay, let's just get rid of the anathemas, there would be 10,000 me's in Antioch. That would happen because that has historically always happened. Somebody's going to say, no, I can't do that. I won't walk away. And that's part of it. It's funny because Father John Romanides was brought up. You brought him up there, Peter. And in these discussions, it was very interesting because of the fact that part of his motivation, and he states this later, I forget if it was on pravoslavia.ru, I read that, but he states it later, his motivation was to throw St. Leo under the bus because he had an anti-Western animus. But St. Leo is one of the greatest saints of our church, and to do that would be a sin. But, Father John Romanides had his opinions. So the point is, if we're looking at the difficult geopolitics of it, and then there's the geopolitics, it's scary stuff. So, in a sense, I'm kind of glad I'm an outsider because I don't know how that sausage is going to be made, and I don't know how it's going to work. But I'm hopeful with the whole Father Matthew IV thing.
Well, let me get Subdeacon Daniel into this, which would be, we heard what the agreement says from Peter G. And it would seem to me the question is, how is it interpreted, right?
It's
If it's
you.
allowing the church to literally jurisdiction, depending who walks in, and it gives orders for kind of celebrations, how is it interpreted here in America from what you've seen? And do you know how it's interpreted in the old countries?
Yeah, it's interpreted how it's being applied. That's the like. If we want to know any official interpretation, we see how it's being practiced by the people who made the agreement in the first place. So we know that in Syria, it's happening much more often, much more strong because of localities of the Christians there. It's a delicate environment to say the least in Syria. However, here it's also happening. Whether again, like what Peter is saying, like what Deacon Joseph is saying, it's happening whether we like it or not. It's happening because this is, and I've spoken to clergy about this. I've spoken to hierarchy about this, and they've all confirmed it to me here in the United States that this is an applicable agreement that is taking place. And not only that, but if the anathemas are being said against each other's saints, it would not be taking place. It's taking place, part of the understanding that one of the reasons why the agreement is even semi-logical is because the anathemas against each other are not currently being said. They haven't been lifted, but they're not being said. So I've heard the word frozen in that, for example, Sunday of Orthodoxy, Antiochian parishes I'm familiar with are not saying the anathemas on St. Severus or St. Dioscoros. And we are not saying the anathemas on Leo and Chalcedon. And if we were, and if it was happening, it would be totally illogical to have my bishop preside over Peter's liturgy, or Peter's bishop preside over my liturgy. Would not make sense whatsoever if saints from either side are being anathematized by the other party. Regarding the Copts and the other, the Greeks or the Russians or the Ethiopians, nowhere else is this happening. So they don't have these types of agreements. And
I think the Copts in Alexandria do.
If they do, I don't know about it.
Yeah,
I don't know if the Copts that I know about it. But regarding what I said earlier on the show, the only official objection that I've seen on a document is not from any patriarchate in Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy. It's a few monks on Mount Athos who are complaining that the Antiochians went into communion with the non-Chalcedonians when they didn't accept the councils. Again, not because they don't agree with Christology, but because they didn't accept the councils. So
let me interject this.
Athos a little bit.
Let me interject this real quick, and this is it could be for anyone the answer, but it's more so for Subdeacon Daniel and Peter, which would be when there's a divorce between two parents, mom and dad, they've got visitation days, right? The kid goes to mommy's house, the kid goes to daddy's house. No one would confuse that to mean that they're still technically married, just because the kid could be under mommy's house, coming under daddy's house. So for what it sounds like to me, there seems to be an agreement where if the children here aren't the kids between mommy and daddy, but the laity, they're letting the children go to visitation to one and the other, depending on who's in town. And so what I'm wondering is, could we authentically call that intercommunion, because it sounds to be more an agreement along jurisdictional lines and boundaries that are constantly shifting? I mean, I'm speaking aloud, so any comments on that? If
the Mount Athos monks understood it as the Antiochians went into communion with the non-Chalcedonians. If this is what they said. So they understood it like this.
You want me to read it, Daniel, or you have it?
Please read it. If you have it.
Yeah, I have the excerpt because it's so when they write the letter to the ecumenical patriarch at the time, the letter is more so focused around the Bellarmine agreement, but they do mention the Antiochian agreement. They write, "We cite the case of the Patriarchate of Antioch, which without a pan-Orthodox decision has proceeded to ecclesiastical communion with the non-Chalcedonians. This was done despite the fact that a most serious issue has not yet been resolved. It is the latter's non-acceptance of the ecumenical councils after the third, and in particular the fourth, the Council of Chalcedon, which in fact constitutes an immovable basis of orthodoxy. Unfortunately, in this case too, we have not seen a single protest by other Orthodox churches."
And so this being the case, and then I want to give Deacon Joseph Swayden some time to respond, because his ecclesiology, I think, maybe, I wouldn't say, he'll say is more correct than maybe yours, right? So let me ask you guys first, which would be this. Does this mean that you, Deacon Daniel, the Chalcedonians are within the canonical boundaries of your church, and you, Peter G., that the Syriac Orthodox are within the canonical boundaries of your church?
So I think something that like maybe Peter and I have noticed because we never got into it as much as we did to prepare for this, to talk about it on the show, to make sure we know what we're talking about. So
it's more fun to make things up.
Yeah. So after looking at a lot of things and things that are related, like Peter mentioned, the Great Litany, where both of our kidnapped bishops are mentioned without distinction. When a bishop in either of our churches are reposed, or one of our patriarchs is reposed, or something, it's always done together. So it's almost like two C's in one. I don't know.
So to make clear, you always commemorate the patriarch of each jurisdiction.
No. So what I meant is, if one of the patriarchs reposes, like their church will mention it, or my church will mention if their patriarch reposes. But right now, currently, both of our bishops of Aleppo were kidnapped by ISIS, or we don't know who, but probably ISIS. So currently in the Great Litany, both are mentioned in both of our liturgies in the Great Litany without distinction. Like, they don't say the Greek Orthodox Bishop of Antioch and the Syriac Orthodox, of Aleppo, and the Syriac Orthodox Bishop of Aleppo. They don't say that. They just say Metropolitan Boulos and Metropolitan Yohanan. Like they say them, Bishop Yohanan, they say them as if they're two bishops of the church. So let's say, Craig, you're a Bulgarian, you're visiting the Antiochian church, and you hear in the Great Litany that they're praying for these two bishops who are kidnapped. You're not going to know one of those guys is non-Chalcedonian. They're praying for them together equally.
Yeah, that can be obviously confusing. So let me bring this now to Deacon Joseph Swayden, I'm asking you, Deacon Joseph, which would be, being that this is being interpreted as intercommunion, it doesn't seem like it's full blown, obviously, being that it seems mostly along the lines of who's in town. Maybe I'm just being too obsessed over that point. As you understand the ecclesiology of the Orthodox Church, would this mean that global, I think you call our church is global Orthodoxy. Would you understand that global Orthodoxy to have Oriental Orthodoxy within them, or do you still think it's not clear enough?
Oh, no, it's definitely not clear enough if we're talking about Orthodoxy globally. The simple reality is that that's not the way communion works. Communion works with diptychs, etc. And this is part of the reason why I brought up that for the past 24 years, non-Chalcedonians have gone to Constantinople, have gone to Moscow to fulfill the end result of what these dialogues were meant to accomplish, and they're basically rebuffed every time. Because, and this is where, if we're talking about Antioch, if we're talking about Syria, then I would say your divorce analogy kind of makes a lot of sense because of the fact that, we're talking, basically you're talking about what people in this group are doing. But if you take the picture out of Antioch, if you go to Greece, for example, there was on Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus's, he occasionally had interviews. He did one with a Coptic priest who actually came to Greece and converted to Chalcedonian Orthodoxy and is in his diocese. And this was only like 2 or 3 years ago. So outside of Antioch, the picture becomes a lot less clear because from that side, you mentioned monks on Athos. I'm a little hurt because Mount Athos is the center of Orthodox monasticism, and I don't want to say a few monks because the biggest monastery on Mount Athos is still a non-commemorator monastery called Esphigmenou. It still has the most monks out of all the monasteries there. So the point is, even a few monks can make a difference. But this was, I believe, it was a letter from the Sacred Community, if I remember correctly, and that was from all the heads of the monasteries on Mount Athos, not one. So this is something that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about that, because people take Mount Athos seriously. More importantly, you don't. That's the thing. Outside of Antioch, when you're interfacing with the rest of global Orthodoxy, I don't see that there. Now, granted, one could make the argument that when you're praying for the 2 kidnapped bishops, and I hope both of them are safely returned, even though I, being pessimistic, am not even sure they're alive. The point is, people pray for the president of the Divine Liturgy, but that doesn't mean he's Orthodox. We're supposed to pray, and especially in that case, because it's such a terrible, tragic case. But it doesn't prove. It doesn't logically, therefore, prove that the two sides are in communion. Now, granted, what does prove it is the documents, and that I will say that, and that's where all the kind of confusion stems from, and where Mount Athos, correctly, in my opinion, said that's not acceptable. And I'm not trying to say that in an insulting way. I'm not trying to say that with, a historical voice of, submit to the empire or anything like that, but simply our theology works with all 7 councils. And I think that that's why I bring up the case of Father Matthew, because it's such a fascinating case, because deification is the logical conclusion, but it's not just a logical, it's also a spiritual conclusion of a diophysite position. And that's so that's where I stand on that.
Well, Deacon Joseph, let me ask you this to clarify, because this now will have to pertain to true Orthodox ecclesiology.
Mhm.
I mean, would this convey to you, and I'm not going to insult us, you're entitled to your opinion. Will this convey to you that that global Orthodoxy has gone into some sort of major error, that that they wouldn't have canonical orders? Because, I mean, they're treating the bishops of Oriental Orthodox just like they're treating the bishops of Georgian Orthodox and Bulgarian Orthodox. So what would your reflection upon this be as an old calendarist Orthodox?
Well, as an old calendarist, of course, I mean, and I don't like that term. I just use true Orthodox. But the point is,
I'm sorry, as a true Orthodox.
Yeah, but the point, that's fine. The point I'm trying to make is, from my perspective, ecumenism it's way worse than just the agreements that are to some degree dictated by practicality in Antioch. There's no practical reason to commemorate the Pope of Rome in Constantinople, but it's done. There's no reason to have dialogues between the Pope and Patriarch in Havana. That caused non-commemorators in Moscow, but it's done. There's no reason for the Serbian Patriarch, when the whole synod says don't have gay marriage, to go, well, I guess a civil union would be okay, but it happens. But the point is, so from my perspective, and that's looking at it from a global perspective, because there are true Orthodox in every country, my perspective would be that it's much bigger than this agreement. But this agreement is bad. But this agreement has detractors in global Orthodoxy, which is why I'm trying to be as impartial as possible, because my position is simply not the same as what, say, the Patriarch of, the Archdiocese of Athens or the Patriarchate of Moscow is, but it's not that different, is my point, because otherwise they would have just gone through with the removal of the anathemas and we'd have global chaos.
Well, what do you think of our holy orders, though?
I think they're real. Like, I don't. It depends on the situation. I personally believe that there's still grace. That's a personal belief. I believe that there's real holy orders there. I don't believe the Holy Spirit's not coming down. I realize as a true Orthodox, many true Orthodox hold that position. They do, in fact, hold the position that we don't recognize any of your mysteries. But then a lot of them hold the position we don't recognize any of the other true Orthodox's mysteries. And this is kind of, unfortunately, when you were talking about it, that is really more like the situation in the Meletian schism than anyone realizes, because these groups were not simply saying we're not in communion with that group. They were literally rebaptizing each other. And that's the sort of crazy it can get to. And that's the sort of crazy I've experienced for 20 years. But the point is, I don't hold to the position personally that world orthodoxy is without grace. I don't hold to the position that you can celebrate unless you have an identical understanding of the faith. And this is part of the reason why these ecumenical dialogues bother me so much, because of the fact that it's literally throwing hundreds of years of our history under the bus, and we can't do that.
And I want to actually get to that because I think we're all in agreement on that. But let me ask you one last clarifying question.
Sure.
Which would be then, how about the grace within the Oriental Orthodox communion? Would you see them as them not being Chalcedonians? They would be outside of that.
That's the thing. I mean, I can't speak to a situation. I know they're not formally, they can't be considered in the church because they don't agree with the 7 councils. But again, I wasn't expecting that what I saw with, as I said, and that's why I was very inspired by the situation with Father Matthew the Poor. They could just be geographically estranged, to the point where they have no idea what the rest of the world was thinking, and now that they're learning about the rest of the world, they're like, hey, Chalcedon doesn't sound that bad. And if that's the case, I'm all for it. I think that's great, because that means they might in the future reunite on the basis of the councils, which is the only basis we can have.
All right, so let me get everyone in on this issue, and which would be, Peter, let's start with you. We just heard what Deacon Joseph had to say. We're not going to solve the issue whether Chalcedon is right or not. Of course, we think it's right because we're Eastern Orthodox. But this agreement, is this sort of like the Orthodox version of Amoris Laetitia, where they're kind of having their cake and eating it too? They're not really changing anything, but they're like, you know what? We're not going to change anything official, but we're just going to go do it anyway. We're going to go have intercommunion. Like, is this what's really going on?
So I first I read the document, right, and now I'm going to critique it a little bit, and even the timeline, because something interesting happened. So here I'm going to take Deacon Swayden's side to some degree, but we see the document form, and I think the document that Deacon Swayden is referring to in 1993 is the proposal of the lifting of anathemas between, and that was actually between the Oriental and the Eastern Orthodox. Both communities. They do lay out a few interesting comments there, and I'll read them real quick and then I'll go on. But point 2 says the lifting of anathemas should be made unanimously and simultaneously by the heads of all churches on both sides through the signing of an appropriate ecclesiastical act, the content of which will include acknowledgments from each side that the other one is Orthodox in all respects. Obviously, that hasn't happened. That never happened. So I think we have a unique situation in where the agreement between the Antiochians and the Syriacs, it was signed and perhaps put into place with maybe a plan for a follow-up of some sort, which does not ever seem to have happened. So there are real issues still present, like what Deacon Swayden mentioned. There are anathemas that we have to deal with. There are fathers on both sides that we have to deal with. We have to reconcile, post-schism saints and just, it's not a true union, a union agreement, because we still have 2 patriarchs. We still have distinct bodies of Christians that exist in Antioch. Ones that celebrate the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom and the others that celebrate the liturgy of St. James. So there are a lot of differences that are still in place. And I think it would be, I don't think it would be prudent to say that this document solves everything, right? But this document does make some interesting assertions. This document can be perceived as perhaps one of the reasons that that relations are what they are today between the Antiochian Church in Syria and the Syriac Church in Syria and perhaps elsewhere. So it's not perfect by any means. I don't think we can call this a full communion agreement. I don't even know if we can call it a limited communion agreement. We can call it an agreement that deals with communion, perhaps.
But isn't this the issue with liberalism, where you could just go ahead and do things and you don't really actually have it theologically hashed out or canonically hashed out? Is that what we're really seeing here?
Well, I posed this question to Daniel actually the other day, and Daniel had a pretty good response to me. He asked me, well, how do two communities that have been in schism for over 1,000 years, how do they reconcile? Like, what does that process even look like? They can't hold synod together if they have disagreements, right? So I would ask that same question now. What does it look like when two communions begin to at least explore the possibility of coming together? They can't hold synod because there are fundamental disagreements. One rejects 4 ecumenical councils that we affirm. But where is the starting point, right? If we consider the dialogues as a starting point, what comes next? And I think that's a very important question that we have to consider in kind of figuring out where we go from here. Since 1993, we haven't seen really anything on these documents. It's not a surprise to anyone.
Well, why would they need to, though? Right? Like,
right. Well, to some degree, yeah, you're right. But then you have the Syriac patriarch, who Daniel knows, at his enthronement ceremony in 2014. He literally reaffirms that agreement. The Patriarch John X, we don't see that in his enthronement. In fact, we don't see any sort of affirmation or confession of faith. Really, we read through the speech, but we do see the Syriac Patriarch reaffirming it. So that is kind of like the newest official development, I guess you could call it. But there has been essentially a silent period since '93 on the matter.
Okay, and let me give you, Subdeacon Daniel, an opportunity to give your personal opinion on this. I understand, being that you're actually ordained, if you had to pass it or be really political, that's fine. But let me give you an opportunity to respond.
Thanks, Craig. So, yeah, I mean, I think Peter says it perfectly. What does reconciliation look like? It's been 1,500 years. There's no real precedent for something like this. So it's not like there's a model that we can follow to know exactly how to do this after so long. If any form of like full reconciliation happens, it will be the first time that, like, we've been talking about apostolic churches reuniting. I don't know, all of these online communities, that's all they talk about, like theoretical reunion and so on and so forth. But there's no model. There's no like practical model for this 1,500 years down the road. So what Peter's asking, and what is right, is that if they wanted to have a fruitful, productive conversation, what does that look like? If they wanted to reunite completely, what does that look like? If we say they need an ecumenical council, you can't have an ecumenical council with a side that is not Orthodox in order to decide if they're Orthodox. That's not how ecumenical councils work. There's the judges and the judged. That's ecumenical councils. So, but if there's a reconciliation council, you're already going into the council knowing that everyone there is Orthodox already. That is not the case right now. So then, in order to get to that point, there needs to be something else. Now, if we're saying that the Antiochian Syriac agreement is premature or not, that is our, like you said, Craig and Peter and Deacon Sweden, this is all of our personal opinions. It's really irrelevant. What is matter of fact is these agreements exist and they are being applied by the two churches, and all of the other patriarchates in both families know about it. So for them to know something and to be quiet is also a statement. The other churches, I mean. And then for these two to be in communion together consistently without anyone. Do you guys remember when Pope Francis became Pope and those two Greek bishops wrote this really long paper against the Catholic Church, telling him to repent and become Eastern Orthodox? I don't know if you guys remember.
I loved that paper.
Did it work?
So clearly not. So in this case, like Peter, when Peter's saying that there's been silence since 1993, there's been silence on every position. Like there's been silence in that it hasn't developed, but there's also been silence in that nobody's saying that this is wrong, you guys shouldn't do it. So it's kind of now left, like he said, my patriarch, in our enthronement of our patriarch has to give a confession of faith where he defines what he believes about the Trinity, Christology, all of these things. At the end of this, he affirms the agreements that he's going to that he's received from his predecessor and that he will keep moving forward. In the Antiochian enthronement, I watched it all. I couldn't see any confession of faith, at least publicly. The Antiochian patriarch does not give a confession of faith for him to have that part of the ceremony, so it was non-applicable. But in the Syriac case in 2014, the agreement was reaffirmed explicitly. So again, there's nothing moving forward, negative or positive. But so the status quo is 1991.
Right, Deacon Joseph.
Yeah, I was going to say this is I hate to say this, but we're kind of stuck. Well, I mean, not me personally. I mean, but the whole situation is kind of stuck because of the fact that it came in under, I hate to say this, bad circumstances. There were discussions over centuries, and those discussions were always held on the basis that both sides had the conviction of the faith. Unfortunately, modern ecumenism, and in its forms, takes its lead from the West. And not only that, but it takes it in a very effeminate manner. I can read. I don't want to be rude, but and I read those agreed statements from the 60s and 70s. You compare them to what our saints said during those periods. Compare it to what Subdeacon Daniel's saints said during the period. And you know what you see is lacking in these modern statements? Testosterone. The reason I say that is because of the fact that they don't sound like men. They're not defending the faith. They're not defending what they believe. And the reason they're not doing that is because ecumenism had a very perverse start, and it was pushed, through liberal Protestantism and then Roman Catholicism, and everyone went along with it. And we thought that's the model. But the problem is that what a lot of the ecumenists said over the years was wrong. For example, a good example of this is in the dialogues that we find in the modern period between the Antiochian jurisdictions. You see the talk of differences in language. That's something that came up with the Ecumenist West, and they had the Oriental resurgence when they started printing out the what was it called, the Patrologia Orientale. And that was a big deal. But what they wanted to prove was that the Copts and the Syriacs, etc., were speaking a different language. Not remembering, of course, that when all of these original people spoke, they spoke in Greek. They all understood each other. So the idea of we're going to just pretend that nobody understood each other is wrong. And that's what led to the confusion we're in today. What the best way to move forward is for people to start analyzing all of the discussions. start analyzing what did our fathers say, and that's not just saying that on my end, also on Subdeacon Daniel's end. What did they say, and what conclusions can we draw from that? Now, I personally believe you can only come to the conclusion that, my personal belief is that Chalcedonian Orthodoxy is Orthodoxy. That's it. But that's, maybe Subdeacon Daniel will come to a different conclusion. But I have to look at the reality of the situation, and this is where it's going to sound a little bit. I've been kind of cynical the whole time, and this is going to sound really bad. And I hope
Yeah,
it
you haven't
doesn't
been that bad.
cause here's the reality. What that agreement did in 1991 is it said that the Antiochian Chalcedonians and the Antiochian non-Chalcedonians would not try to convert each other. Now, the reality is that in Syria, the non-Chalcedonians are twice the size of the Chalcedonians on pure numbers. And I'm not saying this, again, Subdeacon Daniel, I know I'm talking about the hierarchy, etc., not you. But the point I'm trying to make is I can see the politics, because the simple reality is if Antioch now says, the Chalcedonians now say, well, we're going to just follow through on this agreement and say goodbye to Chalcedon, bye-bye Antiochian Patriarchate Chalcedonian. It's just gone. On the flip side of that, if they don't do that, when the non-Chalcedonians approach other churches, like they have with Greece and with Russia and with Constantinople, and they get rebuffed, the hope, and this is, if we were being honest, and that's why I wish people were more honest about these things, would be to just say, well, maybe reconsider Chalcedon again. But we don't say that. What ends up being said is, we'll just refer it to someone else. And that's not fair to them. But at the same time, the point is, globally, if we followed through, or if World Orthodoxy followed through on what was said there, and I'm not just talking about the Antiochian Patriarchate, we would be back in the period of the Henoticon all over again. Nobody would know where anything is. Everybody would be fighting each other. People would be anathematizing each other left and right. You would all look like true Orthodoxy. That is what would happen, because that is what happens whenever people abandon the teaching of the church for heresy. It's just that simple. And I don't want to offend, but that's what I'm saying, is that there's a reason.
God bless you. You just managed to defend absolutely everyone.
No, it's okay.
I wasn't really trying to defend anyone, but I'm just saying from a practical standpoint.
If correct me if I'm wrong here. So your position right now is that it's ecumenism and therefore essentially hogwash, right?
Well, I'm saying that if we were to approach it honestly, instead of approaching it with the language that the ecumenists created, we'd probably get a lot more accomplished. These dialogues wouldn't look like, hey, I agree, hey, I disagree. They'd actually be like, okay, well, let's talk about what Severus did here, here, and here. Let's talk about what Leo did here, here, and here. They would actually look more like this show than they would like those documents. So the point is,
but I don't think the question here is whether it's an ecumenist document, right? I think the question is the document, does it indeed exist, and is it
right,
valid in praxis, I guess. And that I think that's the question, right? So I think we're kind of rabbit trailing when we get into accusations of ecumenism and things like that.
Well, I'm not trying to accuse you. What I'm saying is simply, if we're looking at it from a realistic standpoint, the only way to interpret that document is that it is being implemented in Syria, and the rest of the Orthodox world doesn't care. That's the only way we can interpret that if we're looking at what actually people have done. But if the reason we're in that situation and why it's been frozen is because of the fact that we're in a paradigm where you can't progress, because what we've ultimately done is said, this is what we're going to do. And if you do anything else, it changes everything. Now, I personally am an advocate for doing something else, because I think it might be more productive in the long term. But I realize that it does exist, and it's implemented in Syria. It's not implemented anywhere else.
Well, I'm going to give my final opinion based upon everything I heard. I think we all agree this exists in Syria. I'm going to go on a limb and say it also exists here in the United States, which is definitely the most liberal area in all of global Orthodoxy. And so if it's existing in Syria, it exists here. Everything that people living in the United States that are Syriac Orthodox or Antiochian Orthodox, they see this every day. or not every day, but they see it often enough that they see it happening. It's not just something happening in the fog of war in Syria or something like that, or Jordan or whatever. So that's something I see. Another thing it seems to me is that there's an expression, why buy the cow when you get the milk for free, right? Why sign the agreement to get everyone Chalcedonian or to get everyone Severan when you get the milk anyway? And I think that's where the ecumenists, the liberals, whatever you want to call the group of people, this is the epistemology that is at play right now, is that you don't need to hammer everything. I don't actually need to solve anything, right? You just move ahead and just do it. And that's what it looks like is happening. I think, a good way of summing up is why buy the cow, get the milk for free. So that way the traditional Orthodox could say, oh, well, we didn't buy the cow, so we haven't compromised Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. The Copts, the Armenians, the Ethiopians, whomever, they could say, well, we didn't compromise Orthodoxy, we didn't accept Chalcedon. But yet everyone's ignoring and looking the other way, that for all practical intents and purposes, there is an actual communion between the Syriac and the Antiochians. So that would be my comments, which I'm totally open to correction and learning. But being that we've circled the wagon a few times, I think we'll do some audience questions, and maybe that will tease out some of our other points. So Orange asked, come on, StreamYard. I think it's coming up. So how can a schism be reconciled if the Oriental Orthodox are not even that united and they flirt with Rome and the Eastern Orthodox? My answer is because people just going everywhere getting milk from all the cows without buying them. So that's the way they want to go about it. That's how I perceive it. Peter, you have any comments?
No, I mean, I think it's hard to. Can you guys hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Craig?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's hard to give I think it's hard to give an answer to that. And the reason that is basically, what we had mentioned earlier is we don't really have a precedence for what this looks like so far down the line now, right? I mean, we can write these agreements until we're blue in the face, and we do as a church, really. I mean, you can. Deacon Swaden mentioned a couple earlier between the Copts and the Greeks, and I mean, there are so many agreements out there, right? But I think one of the issues that we run into is these agreements are just literally ink on paper half the time, most of the time, because they never materialized, right? We never see any follow-up on them. The follow-up takes years and years and years, and it's just more ink on paper. There's never any praxis that's restored or changed. The reason I'm interested in studying more about the Antiochian Syriac agreement is because it's one of the few agreements that has actually seems to have materialized into something. Now, has everything been worked out? I don't think so at all. I think if we're all being honest with ourselves, it's a document in its infancy, essentially. It's a document to get, further conversation going. It's a document that sets some boundaries, and things of that nature, but it's a hard question to answer because I don't think, again, we have no precedence for it, none whatsoever. And then going back to what Deacon Swaden said earlier, I think we do have to grapple with how we reconcile the ecumenical councils, how the Orthodox Church is firm on our view of the 7 ecumenical councils, and the Oriental Orthodox are firm on their acceptance of the 3. Though there has been talk with the Orientals that there has some agreement around the 5th, 6th, and especially the 7th ecumenical council, which we see in the 1990 agreed statements. The Orientals and the Eastern Orthodox do actually explicitly mention what their disposition towards the councils are, but it's a question I don't think anyone could really answer at this point. We just don't have a precedence for it. The jurisdictions have been solidified. We have patriarchates in place. We have bishops in place. We have localities that have been predefined and canonical boundaries, and it's a very, very difficult question to actually answer.
I just recently did a video on the 636 Council of Cyprus, And long story short, how they've generally been able to bring in people outside communion to communions, because being that you don't have ecumenical councils with them, is they have these doctrinal statements. They accept it as condition of entering communion, and there you go. So, for example, if let's just pretend we Eastern Orthodox wanted to become Oriental Orthodox, all they would have to do is we forswear Chalcedon and the other councils. We just accept the three. Will you take us in? And that pretty much solve it. So it's not really a rocket launch. The question is just no one wants to do that, and for a good reason. So that being said, we got this next question, which is
Craig, if I may, if you don't mind, I want to read from since I referenced it from the 1990 agreement, just for further transparency. Point 8 says both families accept the first three ecumenical councils, which form our common heritage. In relation to the four later councils of the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox, meaning the EO, state that for them the above points 1 through 7 are the teachings, and those points 1 through 7 discuss Christology, are the teachings also of the four later councils of the Orthodox Church, while the Oriental Orthodox consider this statement of the Orthodox as their interpretation. With this understanding, the Oriental Orthodox respond to it positively. In relation to the teaching of the Seventh Ecumenical Council of the Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox agree that the theology and practice of the veneration of icons taught by the Council are in basic agreement with the teaching and practice of the Oriental Orthodox from ancient times, long before convening the Council, and that we have no disagreement in this regard.
And that's a great segue. Next question, because that's essentially capitulation to Chalcedon and all our councils. But let's read this question. How would we reconcile St. Severus criticizing into communion with those who do not have the same faith in today's agreement? So let me bring that to something in Daniel. How do we reconcile things with saints that are in your church that are condemned in those councils, which we see accepted in those agreement? And how do we accept what that agreement says with what your saints teach?
So if we're being lawyers about this, what Peter read is not the Oriental Orthodox accepting the agreement, accepting the councils. It is, though, saying that they are responding positively to the interpretation of those councils by the Eastern Orthodox, meaning that the Oriental Orthodox are happy that the Eastern Orthodox are not interpreting their own councils in a way that would be negative. That's all it's saying. It's not saying that the Oriental Orthodox are accepting those councils, right? But regarding the question, I think it's a very good question. And this actually is strongly in support of Deacon Swaden's whole point in this entire show, is that Severus would totally not be okay with this. Like he said.
Leo.
So I think there's a lot of truth to what Deacon Swaden is saying about real, long-term approachment, right? Instead of kind of the junk food that's happening. Maybe eating our greens, which isn't the most pleasant thing, but it's healthy. So I think that in the Antioch, I can't remember what jurisdiction Father John Bear is. Do you guys know what?
He was OCA.
I don't know. Okay. So anyway, he's not. I don't agree with him on everything, but I think he's done great work regarding Saint Severus, and I think the Antiochians in general are beginning to view Saint Severus more positively. Him being even till now listed in the Antiochian list of patriarchs for 6 years. They have his name there. So there are things, like Peter has been saying also the whole show. There's a lot of things we still have to hash out regarding all of this stuff. So yeah, to answer the question, the intercommunion agreements, if we say that the Henodicon era, the end of which Saint Severus was a patriarch, then in that sense, yes, there was intercommunion on both sides during the Henoticon era. However, this does not deal with positively or negatively affirming anything. It was just not talked about. So if we were anathematizing Chalcedon to our Chalcedonian patriarch, I don't know. I don't think he would have communed us. And if the Chalcedonians are anathematizing Severus to Severus, he's not going to commune them, or he's not. If they're affirming Chalcedon to Severus, probably not going to commune them, right? So like Craig said, it was kind of swept under the rug. It's really complicated. It's really complicated.
So Deacon Joseph Sweden addressed this earlier in the show, but I'll give him opportunity just to clean the air again. He's being asked, aren't you traditional Orthodox? Why do you care if the Antiochian Eastern Orthodox Patriarch says something ecumenicist if he's already something much worse?
Well, first off, I care about all Orthodox, so that's something that means something to me. I happen to, were I not true Orthodox, I would probably have joined the Antiochians. So it means something to me. But in any case, also their patriarchate is one of the most interesting ones historically, because of what it's been through over centuries. So that to answer that question, that's why the simple reality is because I care. And halfway going through all of these ecumenistic documents and stuff like that, I was ready to say I don't think I'm going to do this show just because it's such a confusing and convoluted thing. But my old spiritual father actually told me if you're going to come on and say the truth, then you shouldn't worrying about saying the right thing. And so that's kind of why I said, fine, I'm going to go through with it. But this leads me to an interesting question. And by the way, Craig, to answer your question, the reason why you have to buy the cow is because otherwise everyone's stealing milk. Ultimately, what it comes down to
is the gentleman bought the cow.
What?
The gentleman buys the cow. He doesn't just take the milk.
Yeah, but okay. Well, the point is, if you buy the cow, then of course the milk is free. But if you didn't buy the cow, it's obviously not free milk; it's stolen milk. So anyway,
can I just ask you something regarding your ecumenist comment?
Sure, but I wasn't finished with it. But go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please. I want you.
Okay, so if we're gonna simply just chalk up all these and I'm not saying I disagree here, but if we're gonna chalk up all these documents to ecumenism, what do you, and forgive my ignorance here about the true Orthodox, the genuine Orthodox Church. I don't know too much about your guys' history, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that perhaps there have been multiple movements within the genuine Orthodox communion or the true Orthodox communion who have, perhaps signed some sort of joint declaration and went into communion with one another. I know I read an article years ago about two, for lack of a better word, C's, I guess, that came together in the genuine Orthodox communion and established communion with one another. Why is it, though, and assuming this is the case, why is it ecumenism when so-called world Orthodox do it, and not ecumenism when the genuine Orthodox Church does it in order to reestablish or establish communion? I think I'm very curious as if indeed something like this has happened. I'm very curious why it's one way for one party and not the same way for the other.
That's actually a really, really good question. And believe it or not, I think it's actually relevant to the entire discussion we've been having. When true Orthodox, and that's the international community. Now there's three. But the point is that because there's a lot of different true Orthodox groups, but there have been a lot of reunions. The basis is always exactly the same, which is that they can first, of course, they check each other's. They check, do they have valid orders? Where do they come from? So on and so forth. What's their history? Do they believe the same thing? Because ultimately, all true Orthodox believe exactly the same thing, really, actually on paper, even that the world Orthodox do, if we leave out the ecumenism. I have no disagreements, for example, with, say, a non-commemorator in the Moscow Patriarchate, except for the fact that, he's still formally in communion with the Patriarch. Our beliefs are exactly the same from 1923 onward. So, I mean, it would be like asking a person that would be like if I know that there was a break between Russia and Estonia, like 4 or 5 years ago, but that was restored. That was restored because they believed the same things. If you don't believe the same things, then it's not a real union, and this is where that's the difference between ecumenism and reunion. Because like at the seventh ecumenical council, and this is an interesting point, reunited and iconodual parties that were not in communion with each other because of things that happened with the iconoclast, but they all believed the same thing, so they returned to communion with each other. That's natural, and that's the way things should be. Frankly, if any of the world patriarchates, etc., if they in general just said we're going to stop doing ecumenism altogether and we're going to say the Orthodox Church is the one true church, I'd probably just go to the church and say, okay, do what you want with me. If you want me to resign, I resign. Because for me, it's just about preserving the true faith. But I do want to touch upon the Seventh Council again, because the Seventh Council is interesting because of the fact that in it, they actually make a reference to Severus and they make a reference to his condemnation. So I find that very odd that the Oriental Party would actually agree to that. But it is an interesting development. But I want to bring up something
But
else.
obviously, they'd be disagreeing to the decree of the council and not any
Yeah,
of the
no. Yeah, no, I understand that. But what I'm saying is I thought it was an interesting choice, considering that Severus is actually mentioned by name in it. But the point I'm trying to make is I was reading something, because I was doing research on this stuff, and one of the things that I've noticed, like in arguments that I've had, some of them unwillingly, with non-Chalcedonian people, is the focus on radical Kyrillic theology. It's a focus on Kirill is a main and central point. So I was kind of shocked, and Subdeacon Daniel, I'm not bringing this up to attack or anything like that, but I am going to bring it up. There's a writer on Pravmir.ru. His name is Minas Manir, and he was a former Copt who became Russian Orthodox. But one thing that he notes in an article is he notes that even Severus of Antioch criticized St. Kirill's positions at times. He actually cites it. Now, this is an odd thing because I would never get that impression from hearing the arguments on both sides that I'm hearing. But we haven't even addressed it, and that's partially because we've glossed over so much that we're not even looking at what the other side is saying anymore. And so that's kind of where I'm at with that. And I hope I answered your question, Peter, and I hope I didn't offend you, Subdeacon Daniel. If you want the quote, I can give it to you, but I don't know if you know it already.
Well, luckily for you, Deacon Joseph, the internet makes people very angry, very quick to argue over every little point. So that will solve all this.
I'm not offended at all, Deacon. I would like the quote. I'm familiar, but I would like the quote anyway. From what I remember, though, Minas Munir, it's not the quote that he attributes to Severus is actually like we would say an Eastern Orthodox polemic or a Chalcedonian polemical quote that is attributed to him that is not genuine, and that Severus did not say that.
Okay, yeah, because basically. That's okay. So you're basically saying that's a forgery, and I can take that as an argument. I mean, it was apparently preserved by Saint Anastasius of Sinai, and it's in the PG. So, but the point is, and this is where I'm getting at, there's a long history of actual dialogue between the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian churches that is 10 times more productive, even if it's more polemical, because then no one's brushing anything under the rug. And that's to me is the only real path to union. Peter, you brought up the true Orthodox coming into communion with each other. These are people who were previously anathematizing each other and saying that the other side wasn't Orthodox until they actually spoke to each other and said, oh, wait, I guess you are Orthodox. And that's how that works. It's not until we really have agreement that's not based, disagreement can be petty or it can be worth something. And I have to say, when we're talking about ecumenical councils, it has to be worth something.
Right. No, and I appreciate your response to me, Deacon. I think it's an adequate response. And I guess when you take a look at the dialogue from 1964 to 1991, you get a bigger and more clearer picture of what exactly was agreed upon. That's why I think we can't separate the 1991 agreement from the rest of the agreements. I try to, for me, I hear these accusations hurled all over social media and everywhere else, one person against another, accusations of ecumenism. And I like to actually, dialogue and get to the root of what each person means when they make a claim of ecumenism, because I've figured out over the years that 9 times out of 10, what somebody is accusing somebody of in regards to ecumenism is in fact not ecumenism. From what I'm understanding from you is, in these agreements, if the content of these agreements is that the Christology has been worked out between these two communions, if let's say everything has been worked out between these two communions except for how to reconcile the 3 ecumenical, the Orientals with the 3 and the Eastern Orthodox with the 7, and then how to reconcile the lifting of anathemas. Aside from those, I'm assuming you would agree that the dialogue has been pretty fruitful, right?
Well, I mean, I didn't understand your last thing.
It's missing. There's a large gaping hole in the reconciliation efforts when they're not discussing this, when there's no affirmation of the 7 ecumenical councils by the Orientals, and likewise when there's no clear directive or clear decision on the lifting of anathemas. I mean, those are those are large. Yeah, those are gaping holes in the actual dialogue itself. I agree there. So to go into communion without first working out these issues is very problematic, if indeed it is a true communion agreement. But I guess my question to you is, if these 2 issues, for example, are solved, is it then, in your mind, ecumenist, or is it now communion akin to what the true Orthodox have been able to accomplish?
Well, I think it would be communion according to the standard Orthodox theology if that occurs, but I would have to reiterate that again that would involve that somehow the 7 ecumenical councils are accepted. If the non-Chalcedonians accepted the councils, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I don't think anyone would, because that would be a cause for rejoicing. But I think part of the reason we can't get there is because we've moved so far away from even talking about them and their aftermath that it is impossible for us to even see that. And I say that we should look at it as a paradigm. So, because that's the paradigm we used for the better part of 2,000 years. So why stop now?
Let me interject this because I keep trying to put this comment up and it's relevant. And John says that, silence does not mean agreement or indifference. Often it means the church is not hurried to pass a judgment. But I think the issue really is that they're not hammering things out like Deacon Joseph Swayden's saying, like Peter's saying, in a way that's even anywhere close to within any sort of decent time frame. We're talking about early 90s. Guys they finished their PhD dissertations and now they're already retiring by now. We're talking decades that have passed, and usually in church history they've had when they've had these agreements, they hammered things out and have had big problems, and the agreements fall apart, and it happens all much less time than we've just kind of hit with this, which is why I think, and I keep pressing home, that they don't even want to really solve this out on paper because they're already getting what they want. Right.
I do want to comment one thing that Peter had pointed out, that that it had been that things have kind of been mostly on paper. Now, when I first became Orthodox, and that more than 2 decades ago, and I was always in the true Orthodox church, I took those pieces of paper much more seriously than I do now. And to that end, what I mean by that is that I really believe everybody who was those papers were printed, everybody in those churches completely believed it. They completely agreed with it.
Deacon Joseph, you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, hold on. Give me a second. Let me see if I can fix it. But I realize as I get older that the value of paper is often today.
As Deacon Joseph
Huh?
tries to fix the audio issues, I'm going to ask all future answers. Let's try to keep the answers question 40 words or less, so we can get to everyone's questions. So Deacon Joseph,
Okay.
get one more shot, 40 words or less.
All right. 40 words or less. Okay. I've 20 plus years have taught me the value of paper, and it's only worth paper. And to that end, I feel bad for the non-Chalcedonians, because it could have been 25 years of productive discussion, and instead it's waiting for something that's very difficult to implement that won't cause a disaster.
All righty. So this is a question for Subdeacon Daniel. Do you think that the non-Chalcedonians are closer to the Roman Catholics? And I'm going to guess he means, or the Eastern Orthodox theologically. Thank you for the great discussion.
I mean, I don't think this is a subject for debate. I think it's easily Eastern Orthodox. I don't know if Deacon Suwaden knows this, but Pope Shenouda, he wasn't the easiest pope. He had positives and negatives, but for the most part, a lot of his teachings and things he said, they're not Oriental Orthodox beliefs. So like his problem with Father Matthew regarding theosis, today it's looked at in two ways. Either he misunderstood, Pope Shenouda himself misunderstood, or he was just wrong. But Oriental Orthodoxy has always and does now believe in theosis. This is with essence energy distinction, with denial of the filioque, all of these things. I don't think, and obviously we don't have any of the papal dogmas. So I don't think there's anything that makes us closer to the Roman Catholic Church, except maybe for liturgical diversity, which they now have some kind of, since they have all these uniates with them. Now they look more diverse, but that'd be the only thing. And since we have still till now, all five of our churches, they have their own right. The Eritreans and Ethiopians are the same, but everyone, I guess there's four very diverse.
A lot of 40 words there.
Churches.
Yeah. We have this from Subdeacon Daniel. God bless you guys. Isn't that great? Thank you. Your door is always open.
God bless you too.
Thank you.
Always open for you to come on. We have this question, and I'll give it, I don't know, a comment. It says, in Sweden, the non-Chalcedonians and the Orthodox have theological schools together with the blessing of the Serbian and the Romanian bishops, but they don't pray together. I mean, my comment would be this is very common. Subdeacon Daniel Kakish here almost went to St. Vlad's to go to seminary. At St. Tikhon's, they had an Eritrean. I know they have Armenians, and then they get like additional Christological training outside of the Eastern Orthodox monastery and seminary. So I think it's more just limited resources in Western countries. Being that, I mean, I don't know, Deacon Joseph, if you went to seminary or they ordain without that, because I know they do that in the old country and like the Middle East and stuff. But I mean, well, you wouldn't really go to seminary either, Subdeacon Daniel. So, like, would that be generally accurate? What do you guys think?
Yeah, Subdeacon Daniel, who you just put his comment up right now, he goes to St. Vladimir's.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, so there's a big Oriental Orthodox community at St. Vladimir's right now. And I know there's one at St. Tikhon too, but I don't think it's as big. Sweden,
I've been to St. Tikhon's. There's a few there, and yeah, they're I've seen them at the services. So
yeah,
even the Antiochian House of Studies, they just started up a Oriental Orthodox program as well.
Alrighty. So it's definitely going on, and We got another question here. It says the Confession de Sithius from the Council of Jerusalem 1672 states that only an Orthodox, meaning Eastern Orthodox priest, can actually consecrate the Eucharist. Thus, it would seem, unless there is union, the whole idea of having intercommunion would really accomplish nothing since non-Chalcedonians do not have communion. Any comments, Deacon Joseph? 40 words or less.
No, I agree with the confession. I don't mean to be rude, but that's also true with Roman Catholics and Nestorians. I mean, if you don't hold to the Orthodox faith, you're not part of the church. It's just that's basic. I don't want to be rude. It's that I know that I once talked to a guy named, I think he calls himself Severin Zealot on Twitter, and he actually agreed with me because he was like, "Well, then you're outside the church." I'm like, "Okay, that's fine. At least we agree."
Yeah, there you go. Cool guy. We have this from Thomas. Craig, can you ask Daniel, talk about our conversation regarding all apostolic churches already being in union? And I believe this, I hate the concept, but it's a theory. So, like, I think he's asking this, Subdeacon Daniel, which is the Melkites and the Eastern Orthodox already in the down low will let it to communion sometimes. We already know that the Oriental Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox are already doing that. Does that really mean, in a real tangential way, by a thread, everyone's in communion? What are your comments on that?
I don't believe so. Look, in the Melkite Antiochian situation, I think it's different because there's no church authority, there's no binding and loosing. It's just willy-nilly people doing random stuff. It's not like permissible. But even in our case, I think Deacon Sueden hit the nail on the head. Again, I'm using that phrase in that when he said that the diptychs, because you are when we're in communion, like in the fullest extent, when we're in the true way, when we're in communion together, it's we're sharing the diptychs. It's not just communion. It's crazy we're making this distinction in 2021. It's sad because originally these things were not separate. There was no dichotomy there. But now there is. So now you have communion in some instances. For another example, I don't know if you guys know, the Nestorians and the Chaldean Catholics have a full communion agreement that Rome has approved that. So in a sense, then, the Assyrian Church of the East and the Roman Catholic Church, in that way, are in communion. Again, the Assyrians are not commemorating Pope Francis, nor are the Catholics commemorating Mar Georgius II. They're still in communion. So this is like you said, the milk without the cow, or whatever it is. It's that situation. But no, I don't believe. Like, I would never say to somebody, "We're in communion with the Bulgarians," or "We're in communion with the Greeks," or "in communion with the Russians." That would just not be true. If they ask me if I'm in communion with the Antiochians, I'll tell them it's complicated. Let me show you. But with the rest of Eastern Orthodox, I don't think so.
It's complicated. Go watch the show on YouTube. We got a question for Deacon Joseph. He thinks that you guys anathematize Saint Cyril. Could he just clear the air that you don't?
No Chalcedonian anathematizes Saint Cyril.
So there you go. There's a comment I want to put up here. Jerusalem 1672 is a universally received council. It would be just as infallible and authoritative as an ecumenical council for us. Those who aren't aware, this council is accepted by all the remaining bishops of the Pentarchy by the early 1700s and by the Russian Synod in the 1800s. So this Council of Jerusalem is a universally received council, and it's only until fairly recently, Heinrich says, some object to the language the synod used as a Latinizing synod. But I just want to make clear, this is not some sort of like trad Orthodox, us reclaiming council of the Council of Jerusalem. It's cited in the 2016 Council of Crete, which was attended by 10 of 14 local Eastern Orthodox jurisdictions. And long story short, they say this council is binding. So this is the majority position of even Orthodox in modern times, let alone just what standard ecclesiology would.
Yeah, all the true Orthodox agree on 1672. Also, only a few people really denounce it, and that's because they're modernists. No offense.
Yeah, they don't like it says, they don't like the word original sin, and stuff like that. I think we have only one more, and I'm going to try to give it to good old Peter if we can. Do the Antiochians, Orthodox and Syriac Orthodox, accept the agreement between the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Alexandrian Greek Orthodox Church? Do you have any details on this, Peter? I think Peter's on mute, or can I unmute him? I don't want to remove him. Unmute Mike. Hey, Peter, you're on mute. Uh-oh. I think I killed him. Wait. It's coming back.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Okay, cool. So I would say on its face, probably not. I've never seen any sort of cross tradition affirmation from either the Syriac Patriarch or from the Antiochian Church. I think more than anything, they're just kind of concerned with their own thing right now. I don't recall ever seeing any sort of cross acceptance. I know there are agreements in place between some of the other churches. I know there's some dialogues in place, but again, they're agreements on paper. They're still missing a lot of substance. There's a lot of variables, a lot of nuances that still need to be hashed out. It's like every other agreement to formalize a full communion. At this point in time, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying there's a full communion between any Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox community. Just paperwork, indicating sorts of agreements.
All righty. So let me give everyone an opportunity for a plug. Peter, do you have anything you want to plug on the show?
I don't. God have mercy on me, a sinner. I don't.
All right, so pray for Peter, and also he's plugging Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Deacon Joseph, how about you plug your show and what you're up to these days?
My show's infrequent, but I'm on the Orthodox Apologetics channel on YouTube. I'm looking at other platforms to move it to because eventually they're going to ban us all. I'm also going to give a plug for wheat gluten. I found that it does work as a fantastic meat substitute during Great Lent. And that's about it.
I can't eat wheat gluten. I don't like you plugging wheat gluten on this show.
Well, everyone else can eat wheat gluten, Greg. I'm sorry. I apologize. But if, you can have falafel.
Falafel's pretty good. I ain't going to lie. Subdeacon Daniel, plugs.
Again, I'm sorry to keep teasing you guys, but look out for our channel. It's coming up. Again, I'm not going to say a name yet because I don't want to be the one who makes it official. Please, like right now, we're in Great Lent, so live your fast. It's if you're just not eating particular foods, but you're doing everything else the same, then you're not really fasting. It's not just eating; it's also praying. It's also helping the poor. It's also loving your neighbor. Living the way Christ intended us to live. In the Greek tradition, there's the Philokalia, and we have something like it in the Syriac tradition, and the Copts have the Desert Fathers. So, for all the viewers, be a Christian, and if your faith doesn't cost you, it's not real.
That's a good point, but we just came up with a name for your show, St. Cyril's Boys. Yeah, and someone asked me, have you tried Einkorn? I don't even know what that is. So the answer would be no. I'll plug the Orthodox churches of Cambodia. If this has blessed you, this is time of Lent. You just got tons of Biden bucks. What are you going to do with your Biden bucks? You're going to buy a bunch of drugs or something? No, you're going to give the money to the Orthodox Church of Cambodia. OrthodoxChristianTheology.com/donate. There's a link to the Moscow Patriarchate where you could directly wire money, or you could do PayPal. But it doesn't have to just be that. You could donate to your local monastery, to your local parish. The parish usually has funds for charities, all sorts of different things. The point is to if this has helped you spiritually, we want to build up the body of Christ, help others spiritually, and this is just one way to do it. Father Paisi will be on the show in a couple of weeks or so. So we will have that coming up. We'll get to learn firsthand what's going on in Cambodia. And it might not be as glamorous as some people may think, but hey, it's going on. Also, we'll have Father Peter Heers on the very next day on this channel, where we'll be talking about the issue of the COVID vaccine. So please stay tuned for that. Well, other than that, I just want to thank all you guys for coming on. Peter, thank you so much for coming on the pension. And Deacon Joseph, always a pleasure. And Subdeacon Daniel, you always have something great to add, and I'm very appreciative. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, guys.
Well, I'll end the show as I end all the shows by quoting Jesus Rock, which is fight to death for the truth. The Lord God will fight for you. God bless you all. Have a good night.